Hello, my name is Mason Tyne. For my ethics project, I'm doing the Israeli-Palestine conflict. The moral issue I will be attempting to answer is, should Palestine be given statehood from Israel? And the brief overview of this topic is that the Israeli-Palestine conflict has been going on for decades and has been marked by power struggle and fanatical violence between the two sides. The very beginnings of their struggle can be traced back to biblical times, when Moses led the Jews out of Egypt into Palestine, which they considered the Promised Land. Many years later, Palestine would fall under British occupation, who, under the Balfour Declaration, supported the the Jewish occupation of Palestine, even though Jews made up a very small percent of Palestine. And this only increased the tensions between these sides only increased when in 1948 the British mandate over Palestine came to an end. And so Palestine would be forced to wage war against Israel, who viewed the Palestinians as being in their homeland, even though the Palestinians were there before. And Israel would prevail and kick the Palestinians out into neighboring Arab nations who were deemed now as refugees from a land that they considered once their home. And so coexistence between the Israelis and the Palestinians has resulted strongly in the favor of the Israelis and much more to the detriment of the Palestinians. My answer to this issue is that the Palestinians should be granted their statehood from Israel. Reasons to why is that if the Palestinians are given their statehood, it would mean less fighting between the Israelis and them, since the Palestinians would have their own independent state. It is also the morally right thing to do, since the Palestinians were forced to leave a place that they called home and were treated by the Israelis as second-class citizens even after they left. And we can also see that they've clearly proven that they don't work well together, and both sides end up losing lives, as seen in this image here, which shows a building blowing up. And it just shows that they don't play well together in the sandbox, and creating two independent nations is the most beneficial thing to do for both the Palestinians and the Israelis. However, objections that appear to Palestinian statehood are that the claim that the Palestinians are terrorists and should not be given statehood, which can be seen by Margaret Herons, who describes the Palestinian government by saying their government, meanwhile, is riven. Terrorists control one half of the territories, and the other half is controlled by a former terrorist. And another objection is that the two sides are likely never able to agree on terms, which can be seen on a Gale opposing viewpoints, which states throughout 2012, 2013, and 2014, Hamas and Israel exchanged fire with deadly results. Ceasefire agreements were made and quickly ignored. It would also, and another objection is that it would also never be passed by the U.S. and would be rejected immediately, which is contended by John Bolton, a former national security advisor, who stated that if the resolution passed, that the U.S. should just ignore it and consider cutting off funding to the UN. My rebuttal to the first statement that the Palestinians are all terrorists and just shouldn't be given statehood is that the Palestinians were, now granted that the Palestinians have terrorist factions such as the Hamas, who are an extremist group of Palestinians who are wanting their freedom from Israel. However, people must realize that the Palestinians have always been the shadow of Israel and have always been oppressed and never been truly free. And this is further amplified by Joel Benin and Lisa Hajar, who stated that Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel have had a difficult struggle to maintain their cultural and political identity in a state that officially regards expressions of Palestinian or Arab national sentiment as subversive. And so the Palestinians, granted, have done very horrible actions, and in no way am I supporting what they've done, but you can empathize with them in a way because they weren't always violent. They were pushed by the Israelis, who kicked them out of their homeland, and they were only doing what they saw as necessary to get their homeland back from the ones that oppressed them originally. And so both sides in the end have blood on their hands, which makes none of them in the right, and thus Palestine should be given statehood because of what they've suffered from the Israelis, since the Israelis have done more to them, technically. And so, a rebuttal to that, the two sides are never going to agree, is that it's this sentiment that shows we have to look at the bigger picture. Only then can we eventually stop what is happening right now. And this can be seen with Deborah A. Miller, who states, the situation of divided government now facing the Palestinians and the world, many observers say, has only created new obstacles for Middle East peace process and more misery for the Palestinians, which show that the two sides are going against each other and fail to see the bigger picture, that if they were to lay down their arms and realize what they're doing to each other only harms each other and there's no clear winner in this, then they would see the greater picture and see that if the Palestinians were given their statehood, then the Palestinians would have no reason to attack Israel. And maybe then they can come up with a peaceful policy that sees what the Israelis want and what the Palestinians want and come up with the resolution. And a rebuttal to the objection that the U.S. would never pass this bill through the UN that for Palestinian statehood. This is the topic of Palestinian statehood is very bipartisan in the U.S. political parties, because in Ben Meyer's article, he states that Obama insisted the only solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict rests on creating two independent states, a Jewish and a Palestinian state, living side by side in peace while growing and prospering together as neighbors. And while Obama was a Democrat, our current president now, Donald Trump, who's a Republican, is less in favor of the Palestinians and more in favor of the Israelis, and has declared Palestinian statehood as not a true thing. And this clearly shows how bipartisan this topic is in U.S. political parties, and it depends what the administration is, whether they're Democratic or Republican. And only then Palestinian statehood would be confirmed if it were more of a Democratic president who would see the creation of the two independent states and peace between the two and make sure of it. The Catholic viewpoint on the Israeli-Palestine conflict can actually be seen in Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, which was made by John Paul II, who actually comments on the Israeli-Palestine conflict, stating the fratricidal struggle that daily convulses the Holy Land and brings into conflict the forces shaping the immediate future of the Middle East shows clearly the need for men and women who have conviction will implement policies firmly based on the principles of respect for human dignity and human rights. And this clearly shows John Paul II, who is a Catholic, the Pope at the time, wants to see this conflict resolved with human rights being put in place, which coincides with the USCCB, which states, following the Holy Sees, lead in recognizing the state of Palestine, addressing security concerns of Israel and the right of all to live in safety, which shows the Catholic view is actually in support of the Palestinian statehood, because it is only out of respect for the people's human rights that want to see Palestinian statehood, and only shows that the Catholic view of things is that if more human rights are implemented in the Holy Land, we can see less violence, which can lead to Palestinian statehood, which in turn leads to less violence between the Israelis and the Palestinians, since both sides are happy. And in conclusion of the Israeli-Palestine conflict, we must realize that action needs to be taken to reduce the violence between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which can be seen in the formation of Palestinian statehood, which can ultimately decrease the violence between both sides. And both parties in the end have done the wrong, but most people, I personally believe that the Israelis have been the bigger offender in the matter, since they've kicked the Palestinians out of their home and made them refugees, and only then this has led to violence, since the Palestinians have been treated as second-class citizens and only retaliated because their basic human rights are taken by the Israelis. This does not mean that what the Palestinians, what they do is right, but we can empathize with them, seeing that they are only doing what they view is necessary, since they've been treated like dirt by the Israelis. And in the end, we must see the bigger picture on how to possibly end the violence, since there are no winners in fighting between both the Israelis and the Palestinians. And ultimately, they have to see the bigger picture in the end. And if getting the statehood takes a bit of violence, but in the end leads to peace and prosperity, I think that should be an option that both sides should be willing to take in the end. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching, and have a nice day.